right, so thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here with me today. So I want to start off by thanking Tam and thanking Stacia for bringing us together for this critical and necessary gathering focused on doing the work to enact change in language and literacy education. Indeed, we have a lot of work to do. So before going further, I want to acknowledge the Cherokee and Muskogee nations, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands the University of Georgia now stands. Land acknowledgements are powerful and important statements that allow for us to respect and to affirm ongoing relationships between indigenous people and the land. But I also recognize that colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to be mindful of our current participation. In this way, land acknowledgements are only meaningful when they are coupled with sustained relationships with indigenous communities and community-informed actions and continuous awareness of the indigenous histories, perspectives, and experiences that are often suppressed and forgotten. In offering this land acknowledgement, I hope that this is part of the collective work that is being done here in Georgia and in the nation to change how we see land, how we talk about land, and how we see ourselves in relation to the goals of the indigenous nations. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of two Black women scholars who I've had the pleasure of having as students, Subin Nur-Cooley and Shawanda Legger, who reminds us to acknowledge our own place in the story of colonization and of undoing its legacy. In particular, Subin writes, we cannot move forward without acknowledging the histories of those connected to the transatlantic slave trade in this space. The relations we're forming here today are built upon the violent history of relations that were occupied, moved, and removed. And this colonial impact is interwoven into this fabric, in the fabric of this nation, this space, and this moment. As a Black language and literacy scholar, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my ancestors' relationship with language and land. 500 years ago, European enslavers and African middlemen raided villages and homes in various parts of Africa to abduct African people for the transatlantic slave trade. In addition to kidnapping, beating, abusing, and sexually exploiting African people, enslavers used language planning as a tool to separate captive Africans who spoke the same language as a way to minimize rebellion. Women, men, and children were separated from their loved ones and loaded onto slave ships, and leaving behind their freedom, their humanity, their homelands, their families, their cultural traditions, and their languages. After a traumatic journey from West Africa to the New World, enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage arrived to the Caribbean, the Americas, and various parts of Europe chained together without a shared language to communicate with one another, or the ability to communicate in their oppressor's language. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks thinks about the trauma enslaved Africans must have felt about the loss of their language and the terrifying sound of the English language. She writes, I think now of the grief displaced homeless Africans forced to inhabit a world where they saw folks like themselves, inhabiting the same skin and the same condition, but who had no shared language to talk with one another, who needed the oppressor's language. When I imagine a tier of Africans on board slave ships, on auction blocks, inhabiting the unfamiliar architecture of plantations, consider that this terror is extended beyond fear of punishment, that it also resided in the anguish of hearing a language that they could not comprehend. In addition to linguistic isolation, enslaved Africans who were dispersed in the United States were intentionally denied access to literacy by law. Still, they needed to learn the language of this land to help them build the physical, cultural, and intellectual foundations of this nation. Despite losing contact with their native language and it being illegal to teach them to read and write, enslaved Africans created a language out of the remnants of their mother tongues and pieces and parts of the English language. This language not only provided a way for enslaved Africans to communicate among each other, but it also provided the means to communicate that would not be fully understood by their oppressors. Fast forward to today, Black children are being penalized for using a counter language, counter literacies, and counter stories that our ancestors were forced to create. This is the impetus of this presentation. The title of my talk, We've Been Knowin, toward an anti-racist language and literacy education, is inspired by Tam and Stacia's invitation to each of us to create and share different pathways for justice in an unjust world through language and literacy education. I titled this talk, We've Been Knowin, to suggest that we've been knowing what to do to move toward an anti-racist language and literacy education. The real question is, what are we waiting on to do the work? We've been knowing also signifies that communities of color, especially Black women, women of color, queer and trans people, been knowing what has and has not worked by way of our lived experiences, and has continuously taught us how to think about freedom, collective liberation, and have built a foundation for what must be done today. The picture on this slide was taken by a photographer in the 50s, and I think it aligns perfectly with my title. I mean, if you look at their faces in the centers, the visual is saying, we told y'all, we've been knowing. I'm a storyteller, a Black feminist womanist storyteller. Elaine Richardson reminds us that storytelling remains one of the most powerful language and literacy practices that Black women use to convey our special knowledge. Throughout this talk, I will tell you stories about histories, personal encounters, my teaching and research experiences as a way to reflect on what has been and what is now in language and literacy education and the urgent need for an anti-racist literacy and language education. These stories will not be told linearly because, as my colleague Lamar Johnson says, Black people's past, present, and future selves are always in conversation with one another. I also want to add a disclaimer that although my talk will reflect Black people's epistemologies and language and literacy practices, I want to point out that systems of oppression that perpetuate anti-Blackness are interconnected with and cannot be separated from how other communities of color experience racism, systemic injustice, and inequities. I believe in Charlene Carruthers' thinking that it is an aspiration and liberatory politic that Black folks must take up for the sake of our own collective liberation and acts the basic notion that none of us will be free unless all of us are free. Sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia, and other forms of oppression do not serve our collective liberation. So this has to be included in our struggle. This suggests that the fight for anti-racist language and literacy education has to be intersectional. So I'm going to do three things with this talk. I'm going to talk about when and where and how I entered this work, community-based critical race media literacies, and I'm going to talk about anti-racist Black language pedagogies. So the theme for this conference inspired me to deeply reflect and think about when, where, and how I enter language and literacy education. This reflecting took me back to what Bell Hooks once said about, for Black folks, teaching and educating are fundamentally political because it is rooted in the anti-racist struggle. My scholarly career is rooted in my multiple identities that I occupy and the stories that contextualize my family's history with racial violence and oppression. My paternal great-grandparents migrated from Detroit in the 1950s to escape the racial terror and violence that they endured in the South. My great-uncle once shared a story with me about my great-grandparents bringing him home from a hospital in Tennessee, and they noticed that someone in the maternity ward writ nigger baby on his buttocks. My parents' educational experiences were negatively impacted by racial integration. As elementary school students, my parents were bused to predominantly white schools and taught by teachers who reinforced racial stereotypes and upheld racial assumptions of Black intellectual inferiority. These intensely negative racial experiences eventually led to both of my parents leaving school and not graduating. Many of you may know Rodney King, but most people don't know about Malice Green. In November of 1992, I remember being awakened by my father's reaction to the brutal murder of Malice Green at the hands of 2 white police officers. I can still visualize the angry tears rolling down my father's face as he called the Detroit Police Department at least 10 times to protest and condemn them for their actions. I recall returning to my middle school the next day, looking for an opportunity to process Malice Green's murder, my father's rage, police brutality, and what it meant to be Black in that social and historical context. Not surprising, all of my teachers were silent about this incident, as if schools and literacy learning stood on the outside of racial violence. My family's history with racial violence and oppression shaped how I see the world, and their stories and actions taught me how to speak back to and against racial injustice. This is what inspired me to become a teacher. When I began my teaching career as a high school English language arts teacher on the east side of Detroit, I wanted to give my students the kind of racial literacies and awareness that my family provided me with. I wanted to enact what Bell Hooks describes as a revolutionary pedagogy of resistance, a way of thinking about pedagogy in relation to the practice of freedom. But my motivation and inspiration to enact a revolutionary pedagogy of resistance did not coincide with the preparation or lack thereof that I received from my English education program. I would have never imagined that my training would contribute to me reproducing the same racial and linguistic inequities I was hoping to dismantle. Don't get me wrong, the Black youth I had a pleasure of working with in Detroit, they were brilliant. But I did not have the language to name the kind of linguistic and racial violence and inequities they were experiencing, nor did I have the tools to speak back to anti-Blackness that was embedded in the curriculum, my instruction, the school practices and policies. I then turned to my career as a language and literacy researcher with questions about how I could produce anti-racist scholarship, praxis, and knowledge that worked toward transformation and social change. How can language and literacy research and teaching work against racial, cultural, and linguistic inequities? What do racial and linguistic justice look like in language and literacy education? How can theory, research, and practice operate in tandem in the pursuit of justice? So I want to take you all back to February 26, 2012. How many of you remember this date? All right, so let me remind you all.
For the first time in history,
something had to change.
This then explodes into a social media revolution, and then everybody knew who Trayvon Martin was.
So the urgent need for an anti-racist language and literacy education became more clear to me following the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. During this time, I was witnessing the ways in which Black people were using these kind of critical race media literacies and digital activism to disrupt the media's role in anti-Black racism, racial violence, and the maintenance of white supremacy. I noticed this as I was trying to learn more about the circumstances surrounding Trayvon's death. I recall reading mainstream media news stories and social media posts that portrayed Trayvon as a thug, a criminal, a troublemaker who got what he deserved. I was seeing the ways in which the child was being put on trial basically for his own death before I had an opportunity to learn about what actually led to his death. I remember seeing compromising photos, some that were not actual pictures of Trayvon, like the one highlighted in a red box, floating across social media that criminalized him and suggested that he was the cause of his own death. Kirsten West Savali maintains that contemporary media culture force feeds the American people a diet of stereotypes, misperceptions, over-criminalizing, and marginalizing of Black Americans through language, images, and omissions. At the same time, I was witnessing Black youth and other youth of color use critical race media literacies grounded in their community's knowledges to counter and rewrite these damaging narratives that were being used to project Trayvon and, by extension, other Black boys as dangerous others. For example, I learned about the activist group Black Youth Project and Dream Defenders, who counter stories and analysis expose the critical role that media plays in the debasement of Black humanity, utter indifference to Black suffering, and the denial of Black people's right to exist. I also watched Black Twitter become a powerful voice and new form of social activism for Black people. Social justice-driven hashtags such as Black Lives Matter and My Next, Shut It Down, and I Cannot Breathe were being used to control our narrative, control our images, produce counter-narratives, express our opinions, voice our concerns, and locate more reliable news and information about the Black community. Movements like Black Lives Matter should serve as a radical wake-up call to language and literacy educators of the kinds of anti-racist critical media literacies and digital activism that many Black students bring with them to the classroom. Yet too often our critical media pedagogies, or just literacy in general, overlook the critical media literacy practices that youth are already engaging in and that speak back to the agents and forces within media that work to stigmatize, characterize, and marginalize them by projecting them as dangerous others. Following the death of Sandra Bland in 2015, activist Maisha Johnson created a blog, 8 Ways the Media Upholds White Privilege and Demonize People of Color, that uses community-based critical race media literacies to counter the master narratives that mainstream media uses to construct and oppress people of color. She starts the blog off with, "Are y'all paying attention to how the media gives you information?" Next, she provides patterns and examples of how mainstream media humanize white people while vilifying people of color. For example, if you look at the second one here, she talks about compromising photos that are used of Black victims. She showed how mainstream media is biased when it comes to the kinds of photos to portray Black victims in comparison to white victims and criminals. She states, when the victim or criminal is white, the media tends to use photos and paint a positive picture of the victim's life. In the case of Black victims, however, media outlets tend to use compromising and damaging photos. A third one, another example is the double standard when it comes to mainstream media depictions of justice movements. As illustrated during the Ferguson and Baltimore uprisings, many mainstream media outlets describe protesters as thugs and animals who participate in looting and destroy their communities. These same adjectives and verbal markers are not typically coupled with white people who engage in riots following sporting events and festivities and at some of our universities. So many of you may remember Bree Newsom, who is an artist and activist who drew national attention in 2015 when she climbed the flagpole in front of a South Carolina Capitol building and lowered the Confederate battle flag. So last year I was following her tweets after the New Zealand mosque attacks, where she was clearly teaching the people about the urgency of critical race media literacies by challenging and resisting societal narratives that perpetuate whiteness and uphold white supremacy. So I'll share a bit of what she said. She said, "Notice how whenever a Muslim commits a terrorist act, the white political class and news media immediately make it a referendum on the religion of Islam and millions of Muslims. But when a white nationalist murders people and write a manifesto, no one interrogates the notion of whiteness. Right. We are taught to view the daily violence of white supremacy as normal. So when the incident occurs in New Zealand, we have to pretend that it is totally different and disconnected from things like racist police violence, racial segregation, racist policies, and racism itself." Here's the thing. We've been knowing about the media's agenda for Black folk. Indeed, our ancestors and elders taught us long ago, the media ain't never loved us. These critical race media literacy practices that we are seeing with Black youth today are part of our ancestral memory and knowledge of our predecessors. Historically, media has been instrumental in reinforcing anti-Black racism and maintaining white supremacy. As Bell Hooks argues, the institutionalization of white supremacy via mass media of specific images, representations of race, of Blackness, support and maintain the oppression and exploitation, overall domination of Black people. Long before white supremacists ever reached the shores of what we now call the United States, they constructed images of Blackness and Black people to uphold and affirm our notions of racial superiority, their political imperialism, their will to dominate and enslave. From slavery on, white supremacists have recognized that the control over images is central to the maintenance of any system of racial domination. The Black community have long cultivated a deep and thoroughgoing skepticism regarding traditional news narratives. For example, Malcolm X warned in 1964 that the press is irresponsible. It will make the criminal look like she's the victim and make the victim look like she's the criminal. This reversal was evident in the cases of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin in 2012, Darren Wilson and Mike Brown in 2014, Brian and Cynthia and Sandra Bland in 2015. Hence, constructing images that promote racial inferiority contributes to the lack of empathy for Black life. Because of this lack of empathy, society becomes desensitized to Black suffering and Black humanity. The desensitization of brutal violence and death of Black people, such as seeing video clips on social media of those who were murdered in real time, like Laquan McDonald, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, become part of the normal order of business. Undoubtedly, these dehumanizing portrayals for Black people in the media are part of a historical lineage that continues to support a white supremacist agenda that leads to anti-Blackness. So as I close this section, I'm just going to throw out two questions. How do language and literacy educators learn from the already existing critical race media literacies that students bring with them to our classrooms? How can we create space in our disciplinary discourse, curricular choices, and pedagogical practices for critical media educators who exist outside of the confines of literacy teacher education?
Job application. I can help to diversify your consumer market is all I wanted them to know. When they call me for the interview, I'll be more than happy to show it. I can say what's good, what I want, and of course, hello. Because I'm articulate.
All right. Oh, y'all can clap. So, I mean, how many of y'all know that Black language or Ebonics or African American English is a rule-based linguistic system that includes features of West African languages, has roots as deep and grammar as consistent as Scottish, Irish, and other world Englishes? All right. Well, despite there being decades of research on Black language, its survival since enslavement, and its linguistic imprint on the nation and globe, Black people and Black language scholars keep having to remind language and literacy educators that it's a legit language. James Baldwin said it best in the New York Times in 1979, if Black English isn't a language, then tell me what is. So I had the privilege of growing up in the D, and that's Detroit. To some of y'all, I think Dallas, that calls it the D, but anyway. So my mother tongue Black language was the dominant language that I heard spoken in my community. I have always marveled at the way Black people in my community would talk that talk. From signifying to habitual be to call and response, my linguistic community had a way of using language that was powerful, colorful, and unique. My mother still remains my favorite linguistic role model. As a young girl, I would try on my mother's speech styles in conversations with my siblings, friends, or in instances where I needed to protect myself and others. This language, this Black language, is the language that nurtured and socialized me to understand the world and how to participate in it. Morgan emphasizes the importance of the mother tongue. She says it is the first language learned as an infant, child, and youth. It is the first source to impart knowledge and insight about language and culture. Growing up, I was fascinated with Black language and culture. I would often write stories, poems, and cards that were flavored with Black language. When I was younger, I made my siblings play school, and yeah, I was the teacher. My young teachings incorporated writings by Black authors like Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Langston Hughes, and Amiri Baraka. In middle school, I created my own family newsletter that was modeled after Jet and Word Up magazines. Black language was never a place of struggle for me. I don't recall any memories of being personally corrected by teachers or my parents telling me to code switch for opportunity or success, though I would peep my mom and dad changing their voices on the phone to try to sound more white when they were conducting business. During my junior year of high school, I remember catching wind of the Oakland Ebonics controversy, which created tension with the Black community about the way we talk. I recall overhearing my math teacher criticize Black language by referring to it as poor grammar and ignorant. My parents took a different stance on the issue. They were sick and tired of the relentless shaming of Black people, the way we talk, the way we walk, the way we dress, the way we eat, and the way we live. I was personally unbothered by the debate and the demeaning messages about a language that my lived experiences had already validated. Black language for me has always reflected Black people's ways of knowing, interpreting, surviving, and being in the world. Throughout my work and within this presentation, I deliberately use terms like Black language and white mainstream English to not uphold a linguistic binary, but to foreground a relationship between language, race, anti-Black racism, and white linguistic supremacy. Smitherman describes Black language as a style of speaking English words with Black flavor, with Africanized semantic, grammatical, and pronunciation and rhetorical patterns. Black language comes out of the experience of US slave descendants. This shared experience has resulted in common language practices in the Black community. The roots of African American speech lie in a counter language, the resistance discourse that was created as a communication system unintelligible to speakers of the dominant master class. I use white mainstream English to emphasize how standard English gets racialized as white. And although this is the standard that is used in many classrooms against which Black students and other students of color are measured, as literacy researchers and educators, we've been knowing that linguists maintain that the idea of a standardized language is hypothetical and socially constructed. So why do we continue to let this drive our disciplinary discourses? Indeed, what we consider standard English is mostly accepted as being proper and correct, but if you ask anyone to define or describe it, many would define it using arbitrary ideas that reflect language superiority. Sociolinguists have long argued that so-called standard English reflects and legitimizes white, male, upper middle class mainstream ways of speaking English. The concept of whiteness is important in understanding the silent and invisible ways in which white mainstream English serves as the unstated norm in our classrooms and would extend to our research. Aleem and Smitherman argues that whites can exercise power through overt and covert racist practices. The fact that it is the language and communicative norms of those in power in any society that tend to be labeled standard, official, normal, appropriate, respectful, and so on often goes unrecognized, particularly by members of the dominating group. In our case, white mainstream English and white ways of speaking become the invisible or better inaudible norms of what educators and uncritical scholars like to call academic English, the language of school, the language of power, or communicating in academic settings. It was through my research with Black youth in Detroit that compelled me to begin using these terms because they more explicitly capture the intersections between language and race. By linking the racial classifications Black and white to language, I am challenging us to see how linguistic hierarchies and racial hierarchies are interconnected. That is, people's language experiences are not separate from their racial experiences. Indeed, the way Black language is devalued in our classroom reflects how Black lives are devalued in the world. Similarly, the way white mainstream English is privileged and deemed the norm in our classrooms is directly connected to the invisible ways that white culture is deemed normal, neutral, and superior in the world. I use Black language intentionally in my scholarship to acknowledge Africologist theories that maintain that Black speech is the continuation of African in an American context. Africologists argue that Black language is a language in its own right that includes features of West African languages, and it is not just a set of deviations from the English language. I use Black language politically in my scholarship to align with the mission of Black liberation movements like Black Lives Matter, because no doubt the anti-Blackness that is used to diminish Black language and Black students in classrooms is not separate from the rampant and deliberate anti-Black racism and violence inflicted upon Black people in society. Like the mission of Black Lives Matter, I see linguistic justice, which is the title of my forthcoming book, as a call to action, a call to radically imagine and create a world free of anti-Blackness, a call to create an education system where Black students, their language, their literacies, their culture, their creativity, their joy, their imagination, their brilliance, their freedom, their existence, and their resistance matters. Black language is the rhetoric of resistance embedded in the hashtag Black Lives Matter, which led to the birth of what some call the 21st century civil rights movement. It is the phonology and grammatical structure former President Barack Obama used when declining to accept change from a Black cashier by saying, "Nah, we straight." Black language is the controversial words of wisdom that Michelle Obama shared at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. When they go low, we go high. It is the Blackness reflected in the style of speech that woke CNN political commentator and NPR political analyst Angela Rye unabashedly and unapologetically uses on national news to clap back and break down racial oppression for the people in the back. Black language is the linguistic inventiveness and signification in the infamous 3 words, reclaiming my time, that Maxine Waters used to drag U.S. Treasury Secretary. It is the rhetorical strategies that Tiana Smalls, a Black woman, used to prevent Border Patrol officers from illegally searching a Greyhound bus and demanding that passengers show their documentation. Black language is also the native language and rich linguistic resources that so many Black students bring to classrooms every day. But let us not forget, Black language is also the language that continuously gets appropriated, exploited, and colonized. Since I began my research in 2008, I've collected numerous examples of what I'm calling Black linguistic appropriation in the ways that Black language and literacies have become capitalized on. Some of the recent examples include the 2017 Mountain Dew commercial that used rappers Fat Joe, Remy Ma, and French Montana song, I'm All the Way Up, to promote their product. And Party City's 2018 commercial using rapper DMX's song Party Up in Here to promote their unicorn party theme. Mars Incorporated also used the Black lexical slang item cray cray to personalize their snicker wrappers in 2015. And MTV culturally appropriated Black language in an article written in 2016 by encouraging its mostly white viewers to stop using Black slang words that were used in 2015 and start using the popular Black slang words that are being used in 2016. I even have to call out one of my favorite grocers, Trader Joe's, for using oh snap to advertise their asparagus. Many fashion designers have capitalized on Black language to create market messages to invite consumers to buy their products. And I cannot tell you how many times I've walked into retail stores to see t-shirts, mugs, hats, pillows that have capitalized and appropriated Black language. Yet, as my research shows, in classrooms, Black language is devalued and viewed as a symbol of linguistic inferiority. So essentially, what this says is, it is acceptable for Black language to be used and capitalized on by non-native Black language speakers for marketing and for play. But it is unacceptable for Black people to use it as a linguistic resource in classrooms and communities. This is unfortunate but unsurprising because Black language is one of those features of Black culture that white America loves to hate, yet loves to take. I did not develop a full understanding of language politics until I started teaching in Detroit, which is really a mess when you think about it because of the legacy of Geneva Smitherman's pioneering work on Black language in Detroit and around the world. Also, some of the most influential Black language research happened in Detroit. And the landmark 1977 Ann Arbor Black English case took place in Ann Arbor, Michigan, only an hour from where I grew up in Detroit. There really is not a legit reason why teachers should be unaware and ill-prepared to address Black language in their classrooms, but here we are. This is why my call for linguistic justice is personal. I see my work as an opportunity to speak to my 22-year-old self, a young Black teacher who wanted to enact bell hooks' revolutionary pedagogy of resistance. Just like most Black people who lived in the D, the students I worked with communicated in Black language as their primary language. It was reflected in their speech and in their writing. On the one hand, as a speaker of Black language myself, I recognized that my students were communicating in a language that was valid and necessary at home, in school, and on the block. But what I was receiving was pressure from school administrators to get the students to use the language of school. I personally found this problematic given that the language arts methods that I received from my teacher ed program catered to native speakers of white mainstream English and assumed every child entering English language arts classroom spoke this way. At that time, I did not have the language to name the white linguistic hegemony that was embedded in our disciplinary discourses, pedagogical practices, and theories of language, nor did I have the tools to engage my students in critical conversations about what I'm calling anti-Black linguistic racism. I can still recall having a conversation with students in my class about code switching when one of them flat out said, "What I look like using standard English? It don't even sound right." My own cultural competence in as a Black language speaker knew my students were speaking nothing but the truth. But as a classroom teacher, I was ill-equipped to address the critical linguistic issues that they were raising. Now let me contextualize my teaching and research experiences within the history of Black language education to paint an even more problematic picture of the injustice and oppression that my research and forthcoming book is part of dismantling. So you all are probably familiar with Carter G. Woodson's quote in 1933. He said, "In the study of language in schools, pupils were made to scoff at the Negro dialect as some peculiar possession of the Negro, which they should despise rather than direct it to study the background of this language as a broken down African tongue. In short, to understand their own linguistic history, which is certainly more important for them than the study of French phonetics or historical Spanish grammar." In 1981, Toni Morrison wrote, "It's terrible to think that a child with 5 different present tenses come to school to be faced with books that are less than his own language, and then to be told things about his language, which is him, that are sometimes permanently damaging. This is a really cruel fallout with racism." And in 1996, Smitherman wrote, "We have kids in the inner cities who are verbal geniuses, but we call them deficient in school in an attempt to eradicate a part of their identity." And let us not forget about that landmark 1977 Ann Arbor Black English case, where a federal judge ruled that by not taking Black students' language into consideration, teachers were contributing to the failure of Black students. I am also reminded of the students' rights to their own language resolution that members of this field wrote in 1974. By viewing the issues addressed in my research through a historical lens, we are able to see that little has changed over the last 85 years regarding the language education of Black students. Indeed, the linguistic injustice toward Black students continues. In general, black language has not mattered in English language arts classrooms, which is ironic since language arts indicate that our ELA classrooms should focus on the arts of language. And if black language ain't artful, then you gotta tell me what is. Furthermore, given decades of research on the black speech community and black language once being the most studied and written about language in the world, one would assume that black students' language and literacy practices would have been embraced as a resource for educational innovation in classrooms. However, critical language and literacy scholars have consistently argued that literacy educators must shift their pedagogies and practices to support the rich linguistic resources that black students and other students of color bring with them to classrooms. Yet many classrooms continue to be informed by anti-black deficit theories and monolingual ideologies that view black language as a barrier to black students' literacy education. The only thing worse than black students experiencing anti-black linguistic racism in classrooms is when they internalize it. When black students' language practices are suppressed in classrooms or they begin to absorb messages that imply that black language is deficient, wrong, and unintelligent, this could cause them to internalize anti-blackness and develop negative attitudes about their linguistic, racial, cultural, and intellectual identities and about themselves. As with internalized racism, students who absorb negative ideologies about their native language may develop a sense of linguistic inferiority and lose confidence in the learning process, their own abilities, their educators, and school in general. My work with black language speaking students over the last 10 years has led to me thinking about the relationship between anti-blackness and language, which I'm now referring to as anti-black linguistic racism. And this picture is that's the cover of my book, and it was painted by Grace Player, who is a literacy scholar in this field. Many of the black students I've worked with often held perspectives that reinscribed a linguistic and racial hierarchy that positioned black language and blackness as inferior and white mainstream English and whiteness as superior, thus reinforcing whiteness and anti-blackness. For instance, black students would often associate smart and good with white linguistic and cultural norms, yet they would use words and images such as disrespectful, thug, ghetto, bad, trouble, skip school, and gets bad grades with black linguistic and cultural norms. As difficult as it is to hear black students reinforce anti-blackness, anti-black linguistic racism, their perspectives are to be expected, according to Bell Hooks, who argued that black people are socialized within a white supremacist society, white supremacist educational system, and racist mass media that teaches us to internalize racism by convincing us that our lives, culture, language, literacies, histories, and experiences are simple and unworthy of sophisticated critical analysis and reflection. This often leads to black people unconsciously and sometimes consciously constructing images of ourselves through the lens of white supremacy. Hence, it is not that black students inherently believe that their language, their culture, and race are deficient, or that black people are intellectually and morally inferior. Their responses more accurately reflect an anti-black language education that conditions them to despise themselves and regard their linguistic resources as insignificant. So my work with black youth helped me to see that black students, again, that we need a type of framework that explicitly names and richly captures the type of linguistic oppression that is uniquely experienced and endured by black language speakers. This is what I'm calling anti-black linguistic racism. What I'm referring to as anti-black linguistic racism describes the linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that black speakers experience in schools and in everyday life. The anti-black linguistic racism that black youth, as well as countless other black people, experience and endure in communities and classrooms is not separate from the contemporary forms of anti-black racism and oppression that they encounter while navigating the world in their black bodies. Anti-black linguistic racism as a framework is important, especially because linguistic racism as experienced by black people tend to get overlooked or is under-theorized in broader critical race scholarship and pedagogies. Indeed, folks will argue until they are blue in the face about anti-black racism, but once language is brought into the equation, those same people will say, well, you have to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. But in the words of Audre Lorde, the master tools will not dismantle the master's house. My theory helps explain precisely how anti-black linguistic racism gets normalized in and through our research, disciplinary discourses, curricular choices, and pedagogical practices, teachers' attitudes, and it shows how damaging these decisions are on black students' language education, racial, and linguistic identities. The anti-black racism that black students experience internalized when they use black language in classrooms is a product of their language education. Carmen Kennard argues that black students learn to monitor their linguistic expressions based on how they have been treated and trained to view themselves in language arts classrooms. Two of the most common approaches that are practiced in language arts classrooms are eradicationist language pedagogies and what I'm labeling respectability language pedagogies. So under eradicationist pedagogies, black language is typically not acknowledged at all. It's not acknowledged as a language and it gets treated as linguistically, morally, and intellectually inferior. The goal of this approach is to eradicate black language from black students' linguistic repertoires and replace it with white mainstream English. Anti-black linguistic racism is embedded in this approach as black language gets interpreted as a defect of the student rather than a defect of the educational system's response to them. Respectability language pedagogies acknowledge Black language. It's not like eradicationist. It acknowledges Black language as a language that should be validated, affirmed, and respected. However, the end goal of this approach is to simply use Black language as a bridge to learn white mainstream English. This approach perpetuates anti-Blackness as it adheres to the politics of respectability, surrenders to whiteness, and does not challenge anti-Black linguistic racism. Speaking of respectability language pedagogies, while I'm here, I may as well talk about code switching. So this approach essentially posits that teachers should treat Black students' linguistic practices as equally as possible, but should encourage them to code switch to white mainstream English to avoid discrimination. The problem with this approach, as applied in most classrooms, is that it encourages students to code switch without any regard to their racial realities or the role of anti-Black linguistic racism and how it plays a role and why they are being asked to code their language in the first place. In our language arts instruction, if our language arts instruction consisted of providing Black students with critical linguistics tools to decode the notion of code switching, they will find that this approach is asking them to do more than switch their language. Rather, they are being asked to switch their language, their cultural ways of being and knowing, their consciousness, their survival, their community, and their Blackness in favor of a white middle-class identity. Still, some believe that Black students must code switch to be successful in school and life. And while I'm not denying that some Black language speakers have not experienced temporary success by way of code switching, I am questioning what gets lost or sacrificed in the process. What is really achieved? Who is privileged with making these decisions about who has to code switch to be successful and who does not? I have heard teachers use exceptionalism discourse with Black students by telling them if you code switch, you can be the next successful or rich Black person. You could be Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Oprah. And first of all, we have to stop telling Black kids that they can be the next such and such and let them be the first version of themselves. Second, do we ever tell white students to code switch so they can be the next Steve Jobs, Ellen DeGeneres, or Donald Trump? No, we don't do it. This is just downright racist. Also, we need to stop playing like Oprah, Barack, and Michelle don't speak Black language, because they do. I have also heard teachers promise Black children that code switching will help them get into college and earn a college degree. And I just have to think about this. So we're asking students to give up your culture and your language in favor of achieving at best a house, a car, and a whole lot of college debt. Why would Black people want to give up parts of their identity and culture for that dull level of success? Everyone should be questioning this. My point is that we can't be out here using these mediocre and problematic measures of success that only legitimizes a white status quo, American dream, white picket fence way of living that is tethered to the death of Blackness and Black language. It is also important to interrogate code switching in light of our current racial and political climate. In many classrooms, Black students are encouraged to code switch as a strategy for survival. However, the students I was working with on a project in Detroit contested this belief. They questioned how code switching could be a form of survival or self-protection when Black people are being discriminated against and killed based on the color of their skin. I remember working with Black youth around the same time that George Zimmerman was on trial for Trayvon Martin. The students pointed out how Trayvon Martin used white mainstream English when he said, "What are you following me for?" And that did not protect him from being murdered. The students' critical questioning of code switching as a tool for survival in the face of racial violence cannot be ignored. There are indeed repetitive instances of Black people communicating in what we would believe as standard or white mainstream English and still have acts of racial violence committed against them. I think about how code switching or white mainstream English did not protect Michael Brown, who said, "I don't have a gun, stop shooting," before he was gunned down by a police officer. Think about Eric Garner, who repeated the words, "I cannot breathe," 11 times before he died after he was put in a chokehold by a New York police officer. The students thinking about Trayvon Martin also reminds me of Renisha McBride, who communicated in what we think of standard English when she said, "I just need to go home," to Theodore Wafer before he shot and killed her when she knocked on his door after getting into a car accident. I think about John Crawford, who said, "It's not real," to police officers about an unpackaged BB pellet air rifle he picked up and was holding in a Walmart store before police officers shot and killed him. I also think about Tatiana Jefferson, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Tamir Rice, and countless other Black children and adults who were victims of racial violence before they could even open their mouth. These instances are clear reminders that code switching into white mainstream English will not save Black people and cannot solve racial and linguistic injustice, and we cannot pretend that it will. My students' interrogation of the relationship between language, racial violence, and language arts instruction compels us as language and literacy educators to ask some important questions. If using white mainstream English cannot protect Black people from losing their lives, why are we telling Black children that code switching is a strategy for survival? Black students understand that while they could switch their language, they cannot switch their skin. I mean, we really have to ask ourselves if we really want to recognize that Black people's language practices are legit. The very act of Black language being created sheds light on our history. The real truth of the matter is that Black people are multilingual, but we don't want to see it, at least not in language and literacy education, because what would it mean for us to acknowledge that Black people as multilingual? What would it mean for us to acknowledge that Black people, that white mainstream English lacks the full capacity for us to communicate our theories of reality, cultural knowledge, and values? We cannot continue to push respectability language pedagogies that require Black students to project a white middle-class identity to avoid anti-Blackness, especially when they are growing up amidst Black liberation movements like Black Lives Matter, which stands against respectability politics and anti-Blackness. To do so is essentially encouraging Black students to accept dominant narratives that help maintain traditions of white privilege and Black oppression. So I've told y'all what I'm fighting against, but the question is, what am I fighting for? What am I dreaming about? In pursuit of linguistic, racial, and educational justice for Black students, I'm dreaming about an anti-racist Black language pedagogy. In contrast to language pedagogies and research that either attribute anti-Black linguistic racism to presumed deficiencies of Black students' language practices, culture, behavior, attitudes, families, or communities, or respond to anti-Black linguistic racism by upholding white linguistic and cultural norms, I'm forwarding anti-Black language pedagogy as a transformative approach to Black language education. To be clear, an anti-racist approach to language education for Black students cannot acquiesce to whiteness or sidestep anti-Blackness. These approaches are not transformative, nor are they anti-racist. Within an anti-racist Black language educational framework, I understand anti-racism in terms of its relationship to challenging anti-Blackness in theory, research, and practice. In particular, I want to underscore a salient point that Dumas and Ross made in their theory of Black crit. Only a critical theorization of Blackness confronts the specificity of anti-Blackness. As far as language education, this suggests that anti-racist Black language pedagogy must center Blackness, confront white linguistic and cultural hegemony, and contest anti-Blackness. Though I'm advocating for a transformative approach to Black language, my vision of anti-racist Black language education, what I'm calling it, it builds on the work of many radical Black intellectuals, which illustrates how I'm reclaiming and reconnecting with the ideas and recommendations that have already been put forth within a Black language research tradition. Black intellectuals make it clear that linguistic and racial justice for Black students are not rooted in anti-Black language pedagogies that cater to whiteness, but in terms of the complete and total overthrow of racist colonial practices so that anti-racist language pedagogies might begin to be imagined and developed and implemented. It is in this line of thinking that I imagine an anti-racist Black language education. And the inner workings of this pedagogy plays out in my book. So the book shows what this looks like on the ground, and it's student-led, and it's informed by the students that I had the privilege of working with in Detroit. So I want to close by saying we've been knowing what to do to move toward an anti-racist language and literacy education. The real question is, what are y'all waiting on to do the work? Thank you.